In this video, we're finally going to start working with that fourth and final field, that is the created at field. We're going to be setting up a calendar picker, which allows you to pick the day you want to add that expense for. This is going to allow you to add expenses in the past. Now, there are two important libraries that we're going to be using. The first one is Moment.js, and you can find that at momentjs.com. Moment.js is a time library, so it makes it really easy to work with, manipulate, and format time. We're going to be using it now with our date picker, and we're also going to be using it later on when we format that timestamp, which is just a number, for visibility by the user. So instead of just dumping a bunch of numbers to the screen, we're going to make it real nice. We're going to say the words January 31st, 2017, as opposed to something like 10,000,043. So Moment.js is going to allow us to do that. The other tool we need is an Airbnb open source project. You can Google Airbnb React-dates to find that. The React Dates library is great. It includes a couple of components that you can use to easily drop a calendar picker into your application. They have a bunch of demos over here, Airbnb.io/React Dates. We can crack that open in another tab. And there are two main components. There's their date range picker, which should look familiar from the Airbnb website. This is where you can pick a range of dates for your stay, for example, but we don't really need that. We just need a single date. So we have that down below, the single date picker right here. We just pick a single day and then we're done. And this is what we're going to be using to allow users to pick the day their expense should be associated with. So to actually get this done, we're going to need to install both of these tools. I am going to leave up both of the websites and I'll refer to the documentation as we go through the process of setting all of them up. But step one is just going to be to head into the terminal, shut down the dev server. I'm going to clear the output and we're going to use Yarn to add both of these dependencies. First up is going to be yarn add moment. We're going to be adding the most recent version available. That would be 2.18.1. Then we're going to go ahead and add the actual React-Dates library at 12.3.0. Now, React Dates does require another peer dependency that we have to install. We're not going to be using it directly, but it is used internally by the React Dates library. That is React add-ons shallow compare. That is at 15.6.0. Now, let me talk about this real quick. So the React add-ons shallow compare library is basically a simple utility function used by React Dates. Now, it's currently no longer supported, but React Dates hasn't changed their code to not rely on it. So hopefully down the line, I can provide an updated video maybe at the end of one of these sections to show you how you can upgrade. But until React Dates goes ahead and removes this dependency, there's nothing we can really do about it. So what we're going to do is just install these three libraries. Now, I've already tested these with the React betas for future versions and everything is working great. So that's why I'm moving forward with this approach. I'm going to install all three dependencies. Once all three are installed, we can restart the dev server and head into the editor and actually integrate them. Everything's installed. I'm going to clear the output and once again use yarn run dev server to start up that development server. Then I'll switch over into the browser, give things a quick refresh. Then over into Visual Studio Code, and we're going to kick things off by messing around with Moment so we can import that first. There's just one thing we're going to grab. It is a default export lowercase m moment from the Moment library. And down below, we're just going to play around with it, logging some stuff to the screen. Now, if you've worked with the date object in JavaScript before, you know you'd create a const, something like date, and then you create a new instance of date. And from here, we have information related to the date accessible to us. We can pull out things like the number of seconds, months, or years, and we can use those to create a formatted string. But the API is just terrible. It is super complex to get even the simplest thing printed. That's why we're not going to be using the date object in this course. And when I'm working on client projects, I never use date directly. I always use moment. Moment is basically the standard for dates. So how do we use use moment? Well, it's actually very similar. We are going to create a const. We could call it date or something like now, and we just call moment as a function. There's no need to use the new keyword. And what we get back is an instance of moment, an individual moment. And if you don't provide anything in here, which we didn't, it just represents the current point in time. So whenever this code happens to run. Now on here, we have access to just a ridiculous amount of methods. So let's go ahead and print now to the screen. Down below, console.log now. I'm going to save the expense form file, and we're going to check out the output over in the browser. Right here, we have an object with a few things on there, but if we go into the prototype chain where all of the methods are defined, you can see there is just a ridiculous amount of methods that we can work with. And this is actually a little overwhelming at first, but we're really only going to be using a handful of them. Moment provides a ridiculous amount of functionality, but we're just going to use the stuff we actually need to use. So to kick things off, let's talk about how we can get the date out. To do that, we're going to be using the format method. So we can call format with no arguments at all, and it is going to print a formatted version of the now variable. Over inside of the console, we get just that. We have the year, we have the month, we have the day, and then we have the timestamp. So right now it is indeed 10:44 in the morning, and I am indeed in this time zone. Now this information is great, and using format allows us to get something decent printed to the screen, but where moment really shines is when we use the methods and we provide arguments to them. So the moment docs are pretty much the gold standard for documentation. They have a fantastic amount of examples, and they're broken up really nicely into small sections. So if we're looking for how we can display time, we just go to the display section. Right away, it brings us into format, and we can see there are all sorts of different patterns we can pass into format. So by default, it shows a ton of information. Maybe we just want the year or the month, or maybe we want month, day, year with nothing related to the hour. We can do all of that using these tokens down below. So we provide these little patterns inside of the string, and it replaces the pattern with the actual value. So it would replace MMM with the month in the shorthand version. We also have 4Ms for the longhand version. So for us, we can go ahead and pass a string into format. I will use 3Ms, and the end result should be a 3-character representation of the current month. I'm going to save expense form, switch over here, and we can see that aug prints, which is short for August, which is indeed the correct value. Now, we're going to be using this to actually display the time in a reasonable way to the user interface on the dashboard. So, for example, the next thing we're going to show is the day of the month, and there's a whole section for that right here. We can have 1, 2, all the way up to 31, or we can have first, second, all the way up to 31st. We can use uppercase D, uppercase DO, or uppercase DD for a 0 padded day. I'm going to use this option, so all I need to do is type it right here, DO. Now I could put it before the month, I'm just choosing to put it here. And the space doesn't have any special meaning, which means we're literally separating the month, August, from the date, which is the 4th, by a single space. If I save expense form, we're going to see just that over in the console. Right here, we should get August 4th, and that is exactly what we get. Now we can continue on this process using any of these values we need. I'm going to wrap things up by just dumping the year on the end. We can have a 2-digit year or a 4-digit year. I'm going to go ahead and use a 4-digit year, which is 4 capital Ys. So I put that right here. Now, if I wanted to add a few characters to format this, I could just put a comma right here. A comma has no special meaning. So there's literally going to be a comma and a space between the day of the month and the year. And if we save this, we should be able to see the final output. August 4th, 2017, and this is very similar to what we're eventually going to show on the dashboard. Now, we don't need to use a ton of moment to get the React Dates library up and running. We actually just use it in a very basic sense. We do need to create a new moment and pass that in. That's how React Dates gets populated with its initial day. And then we also need to work with moment because when the user interacts with that calendar and they pick a day, we get that day back, which means that as a programmer, we need to be able to work with moment objects getting generated by other libraries. Now, we actually already know enough to get all of that done, so we're going to go ahead and start integrating the React Dates library. Step 1 is to import it up above. I'm going to import the named export. Remember, we have a single date picker and a range picker. We're going to be using the single date picker, and we're going to go ahead and grab that from the library we just installed, React-Dates. dates. Now that we have that import in place, there's one more thing we need to import before we actually set up the component, and that is the CSS related to this. So we can go ahead and import this wherever we like. I could import it in this very file, import, inside of quotes, React dates /lib /CSS / date picker.css. Now that we have both of the imports in place, we can actually save things and we can just check out the console real quick. As long as we have no errors in the console, we're good to go. Let's go ahead and actually use this component. Now, all of these components do have required props, and the React Dates documentation shows you exactly what those are. If we scroll down through the setup instructions, things we've already explored, we eventually get to the date range picker, which is not what we want. If we keep going, we get to the single date picker. Right here, we can see that at the very core, we have to provide these 4 props. We're also going to be tossing on some extra ones to customize the calendar to fit our needs. So we have to provide a date. We have to provide a handler for when the user picks a new date. We have to provide whether or not the input is focused, and we have to provide a handler for when the React Dates library needs to change that value. Now, actually setting up these props is not going to be bad at all. So let's go ahead and dive right in. What I'm going to do is switch over to Expensify, and we're going to integrate this into the form down below. I'm going to put it right here, just below the amount and just above the text area. We're going to create a new instance of single date picker, and we're going to go ahead and close that off. There's no need to put any children inside, so there's no opening and closing tag. We can just use the self-closing syntax. Right here, we have to provide those 4 things. We need date. We need on date change. Then we need focused. And we need on focus change. As I mentioned, we will provide a few other ones, but for now, we're just going to start with the necessary ones so we can get a working example up and running. Now, what is the date? The date is just a moment object that represents where you want to start. And we're going to go ahead and start at now. So when the user loads the page, whatever time that happens to be at, that's the day we're going to show up. So if they load the page on the 5th, we'll show the 5th. If they load the page on the 29th, we'll show the 29th. To get that done, up above, we're going to go ahead and set created at equal to a new instance of moment. So we're going to create a new moment and we're going to pass that down, which means down below, all we have to do is set date equal to this dot state dot created at. So date expects a moment. We are passing one in. Great. Now we can move on to on date change. This is going to be a function we create. It's going to get called with a moment instance when someone picks a new day from the calendar. So all we need to do is set up a handler for that. This dot on date change. We can then go ahead and define that up above. On date change. And we just set it up as an arrow function. Now, if we look into the API for onDate change, we're going to see that it gets called with the moment right here. So we can call this date. I could call it now, but I'm just going to call it created at, since that's what the date represents for me. Now, all we have to do inside of here is actually use this dot set state. This dot set state, we are going to be setting the state for created at. So right here, I'm going to set up the arrow function. I'm going to implicitly return the object, and I'm going to set created at equal to created at, which got passed in. And that's it for onDate change. Not too bad. It's very similar to our other onChange handlers. It just gets called by the third-party library. Now, focused is exactly the same as what we might expect. We are going to provide a value here, and we're going to provide a handler here. Up above, we're going to start it off as not focused. So we can set focused equal to false. And we do have to keep track of this piece of state. We can use focused, or we can use calendar focused to be a little more explicit. I'm going to go with calendar focused. Now we have to pass that value down in here, right here, this dot state dot calendar focused. And we also have to provide a handler. So when the user interacts with that calendar, there are going to be times where the third-party library needs to tell you that it's going to close. And all we do is we provide a handler. So I'm going to set this equal to a simple function like our other ones, this dot on focus change. Now we define this up above, on focus change, and we just set it up as an arrow function. I'm going to set up the arguments list, set up the body, and if we want to figure out the implementation details for this and how I know that created at gets passed into this, we can just check out the example in the docs over here. We can see that they have all 4 showing up. So we have date, they just have date on the state, we already did that. They have on change, where they just take the date and they set it. They have focused, which is just a Boolean that they set. And then right here, they have on focus change. So the first argument is an object. They're destructuring it and grabbing the focused property. Then they're just setting that on the state. This is exactly what we're going to do as well. So right here, we can destructure the first argument. We can grab focused. And then we can use this dot set state. This dot set state, passing in our updater function where we implicitly return an object. And we're going to be setting the property we set up, calendar focused, equal to whatever value came back from focused. Perfect. So now that we have this very minimal setup in place, we're actually ready to use the calendar picker. We have a completely legitimate setup. We can go ahead and save the expense form. And over here, what we should see is this picker showing up. Now, obviously, yes, the style is awful and it's almost unbearable. The difference between them, their spacing, we're going to handle all of that later. For now, we're focused on the functionality. So for me, it is August 4th, 2017. I am seeing that right here. If I click it, I can see a calendar pops up. Now, it's not the perfect solution just yet. That's why we're going to configure it. But if I do pick another date like the 9th, you can see I do go to the 9th. Now, you also notice that I can't go back in time. So I can't pick the 3rd. And if I go back to previous months, they're all grayed out as well. We're also going to add an option for that. By default, the single date picker only lets you pick the current day or days in the future, like October 4th, which does indeed show up right here. So now we're going to mess around with just a couple of the options available to us. The first one we're going to configure is the number of months that are shown, and we can actually check that out in the docs. If we scroll down, that is indeed an option. Number of months is sitting right here, and it is just a number. So by default, we're seeing 2 months. If we want to change that, all we do is provide number of months. We could crank it up to 24, or we can just set it to 1, which is what I'm going to do. Now, if we save the expense form, we can make sure that one option is working. It refreshes. I click it, and you can see now we're just seeing a single month, which is a whole lot nicer. I pick November 9th, and that still works. The next thing we want to fix is the fact that we can't pick days in the past. That's an important part of setting the expenses as well. If I buy something yesterday and I don't add it until today, I want to be able to actually pick that day. To do this, what we're going to need to override is right here, is outside range. So by default, they are going to figure out what days are before and after today, and only the ones that are either today or in the future are going to be available to us. So this takes a function, and we're going to define that in line. The function takes the day in question, and it allows us to dynamically calculate whether or not it should be available. And that might be useful if you have a complex set of logic. For example, maybe you're creating a lodging application and you only want to show days where you actually have vacancy, where you can actually have someone stay. For our purposes, though, we don't care what the day is. We always want it to be available, which means that it's never outside the range. All we have to do is return false. This is going to make every single day available to us, the current day and any days in the past or in the future. If I go ahead and switch back to the application, you can see now I can pick days in the past. So I could go back to June 1st, I could pick that day, and now that is showing up. So now we have the ability to go into the future and go into the past, and we were able to set all of this up with just what? 8 lines of code. We can even watch this data change. So if we do head over to the React Developer Tools, I'm going to go ahead and shift those to the bottom of the screen. We can search for our component. We have the expense form component. Right here, we can see our state on the right-hand side, and we have our little moment object. If we crack that open, we can take a look at the raw date Right here, we have June 1st, 2017. If I were to change that over to, let's say, August 3rd, we can see that it changes in real time. So as we interact with the calendar, the state is getting updated. Now, at this point, we have all of our component state values being tracked. That means description, amount, the calendar, the created at value, the note. All of these are getting changed in real time. The only thing we need to do to actually get this data saved is to dispatch an action when the form gets submitted. We're going to handle that in the next video, so let's take just a quick second to recap what we did. In this one, we installed Moment and we installed React Dates. Moment is a great time utility library. We saw how it makes it very easy to work with time. React Dates is a calendar picker tool that happens to require Moment. Now, what does this mean for us? It means that when we create a calendar day picker, we have to provide it with an initial value. And right here, we have our initial value, which is just the current time. So whenever this code runs, we get the current time in a Moment object, and we dump that into the date picker. We then track changes, and we also track changes to focused. Lastly, we provided a little customization. We changed the number of months, we changed whether or not days in the past should be available to us, and if we head over to the docs, there are just a ton of other options available to us as well. Now, the documentation here does leave a little bit to be desired, so if you are having trouble finding something, I recommend searching that on the web, and you can usually come across someone in either an article, an issue thread, or a pull request who's showing you how you can get that specific part of the API used. For now, though, we do have everything set up, and we're going to continue on to the next video where we actually do something when this form gets submitted. I'm excited to get to that, so stay tuned. I'll see you then.